I'm very glad you're able to join us, because last time we spoke, it was very near October 7th and the war in Gaza just began. And now we are an age apart from that. I'd love to hear what has been your life over the past 3 years since we spoke.
Yeah, I suppose I kind of went a little bit viral after October the 7th, talking about my views on the conflict, my views on Israel and Palestine and on Hamas and so forth. And what sort of happened since then, I suppose, is that I have matured into a writer on these topics in various places, including my own Substack, also including the Dispatch, Quillette, The Atlantic. And I try to see myself as sort of a person who's trying to kind of take away heat, trying to advocate for a sustainable, fair, humane solution to the conflict so that people are not suffering in the way that they are in Gaza and not suffering in the way that they did on October the 7th and with all the hostages taken to Gaza. Because I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is inhumane. I think it's just terrible, awful, and unsustainable. I think both groups of people have a unbreakable connection to the land. It's not going away. Neither side's going to disappear. So we have to kind of figure out a way to coexist, whether that is in a one-state solution or a two-state solution. And I'm trying to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Because I think a lot of people have views of the conflict that are incredibly one-sided. It's one side's right, the other side's wrong. And we're going to be on the side of the people who are right. And therefore, the people who are right have to win everything. And the people who lose have to go away, whether that's the kind of Kahanist answer of the Arabs must go to Jordan, or whether that's the kind of anti-Zionist answer of the Jews must go to Poland or Lithuania or wherever. So I don't like either of those kind of end of the spectrum positions. I think that we have to learn to coexist, and we have to figure out, by negotiations and by the long, hard work of talking to each other, how to make that happen. So that's become incredibly important to me. That's what I've been doing, and that's what I intend to continue doing until there is a solution.
I'm going to drill into, we are going to drill into even what you've just said, but I just want to stick on something you said at the beginning. You said that whether it is a two-state solution or a one-state solution, do you think that a one-state solution is a viable option for Israel-Palestine?
Not particularly. I think that it's very unlikely. This being said, I wouldn't completely rule it out. I think ultimately it has to be something that people can agree upon. And if that's what people ultimately agree upon, then I'm not going to fight against that. A lot of people after October the 7th said October the 7th killed the two-state solution. I don't think it's completely killed the chances of a one-state solution, but I think it made a one-state solution incredibly less likely because, with the violence that took place on that day, and also with, I suppose, everything that's happened since then, it's incredibly less likely that the solution to kind of take the heat out of the conflict would be, hey, we're all going to live together now. And I think that effectively the consequence of that is that it has made a one-state solution probably less likely than it was before. When you have, a large spectrum of Palestinian society that believes that Zionism is completely illegitimate and the Jewish people need to leave, it seems very unlikely that you'd want to integrate that element of Palestinian society with Israel. So it seems incredibly difficult to pull off a one-state solution. This being said, there are a whole load of people who are obsessed with the idea of a one-state solution, and so they frame everything in terms of that. So when I make reference to that term, it's usually just so that I cover the whole spectrum.
You're saying you would not reject any solution that is agreed upon and would actually lead to a sustainable peace.
Yes.
For me, just hearing it is jarring, because when I think of one-state solution in the context of Israel, like, okay, sure, in the total realm of possibilities, let's include that. But the thing that comes to mind is obviously not Switzerland or a United States, but a Lebanon at best.
Yes, but that's would be one of the risks of a one-state solution, right? You end up having this kind of sectarian state where there's multiple different kind of ethnic blocks, and people end
not only multiple ethnic blocks with different interests, but ethnic blocks who are some of whom are dead set on the eradication of the others, right?
In terms of whether that's going to be a sustainable solution, a lot of things would have to change. I tell you what, the way I conceptualize it is a lot more things would have to change for a one-state solution to work than for a two-state solution to work. Generally speaking, I am an advocate for the two-state solution because I think that is, in terms of kind of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, that's the most likely thing to work anytime soon.
I'm curious, John, over the past 3 years since you started writing, I find that when I write, I actually understand more what I think, or by doing the reasoning, I come up with more solid foundations for what I think. Has anything changed for you in the last 3 years as you've been writing? Have your positions kind of veered in any way?
I'm pretty stable, to be quite honest with you. I mean, certainly when you consider new things in new areas, like for example, probably my views on artificial intelligence have changed quite a lot in the past 3 years as a result of a lot more artificial intelligence products coming to fruition. My views on maybe the human colonization of space has changed somewhat in the past 3 years because I've learned more about that. I've studied more about those things. So my views can change when I'm exposed to new information, but I don't think that there's been much new in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The fundamentals of it are still basically the same, right? So, I mean, yeah, there's been a lot of suffering. There's been a lot of horrific events and things that I wouldn't wish on anybody, but the grounds for that existed before October the 7th. The grounds for that go back, many decades. So I'm a kind of absolute believer in the kind of Keynesian principle of when the facts change, I change my mind, right? If the facts on the ground or the facts about a situation change, then of course it's appropriate to change your mind about what you think the problem is or what you think the solution is. But I think it's rather dangerous to just kind of like willy-nilly jump around the spectrum, in this kind of almost like bipolar way that I think you do see sometimes with influencers. I'm not going to name any names. I'm sure people can people can fill in the blanks. But there are people whose positions in the past 3 years have changed quite dramatically, directly from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. And I mean, I suppose that can be justified if you have, a wildly different array of facts. But I think in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the fundamentals are still basically the same. And that's why I'm staying in the middle with we need to talk to each other. We need to recognize each other's mutual pain. We need to recognize each other's legitimate history. And we need to work on a foundation, a framework based on principles of coexistence.
What is the realistic path for that in your mind? Because the opponents from both sides, the people who don't trust Palestine, the people who don't trust Israel, you might argue whether they have the same legitimate grasp on facts or the same good faith arguments. But the point remains from both sides, from the extremes of both sides, not even the extremes, from the critics, the John Aziz critics on both sides, is that this is an unrealistic proposition. The other side is never going to really intellectually accept our coexistence. The other side is not going to really make the necessary concessions for this sort of post-conflict separation, because we're not talking about a one-state solution. We're talking about a separation, a clear divide, but which would require the mutual recognition of each other's legitimacy and historical claim to the land, or even putting aside the historical claim to the land, their current right for self-determination on the territory. How do you overcome this kind of rejection? Look, the other side will never really accept that.
I mean, I do think that's a very good question. And I'm not sure I have a perfect answer to it, because I think there are always going to kind of be naysayers to anything. Even when a deal is achieved, I expect there will still be naysayers, and that their position will still be, well, this is a bad deal. There will always be critics of the middle way, critics of the center ground, critics of peace. There'll be the position of the people who killed Yitzhak Rabin, which would be, no, all of this land belongs to the people of Israel. We should not give 1 square inch to these Arabs, right? And on the other hand, people who might say that no, we can't give one square inch of this land to this settler colonialist block of Eastern European and Brooklynite Jews who have come here to steal our land and establish an ethno-state. Those narratives are not going to disappear, regardless of the positive steps that we can take. And I think there are many positive steps that we can take. Now, in terms of how we actually get to that real solution, I think that change of leadership is very, very important. I think that the Israeli government has kind of put themselves into a position where they don't believe they have a negotiating partner at all. I think a lot of people within Netanyahu's coalition don't want a negotiating partner. They want the West Bank.
But I would also argue that it's not just the Netanyahu government that has put themselves in this position. It was also the negotiating partners that has contributed to this impression.
I'll get to that. On the other side, there are obviously Hamas is not interested in negotiating a serious deal with Israel. Fatah is a mixed bag. There are certainly some people in Fatah who, as there are in the Knesset, who absolutely want to negotiate and who want to make peace. But there are also people in Fatah who buy into the kind of Hamas narrative that Israel is like a cancer and it must be dismantled. So
Fatah, for our listeners who have not been paying attention to this particular topic, is the you could say the opposition party to Hamas. It is has mostly been eradicated from Gaza, but it is the ruling party in the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah.
Yes, exactly. So there are people in the Palestinian Authority and in Fatah who absolutely are looking to negotiate. But I would say that the dominant bulk of the people of that background, they're looking to use legal measures against Israel to place pressure on Israel. So they're looking to use things like the ICC, the ICJ, the UN, and various other kind of international legal mechanisms to place pressure on Israel, as well as things like boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. So I think that the appetite for negotiation is pretty low on both sides. I think even on the Israeli side, but like Yair Golan he's not saying, hey, we're going to immediately go back to negotiations with the Palestinian Authority either.
Yair Golan being one of the more left-wing Zionist members of Knesset that is running against Netanyahu. So he's now the head of what used to be the Meretz party. So he represents probably the farthest left in the Israeli political spectrum that exists right now, and that is, still Zionist. And you're saying, is not really showing much appetite for resuming direct talks.
But I think realistically, if he became the prime minister of Israel, there would be an improved chance of a deal. Even I know he's not saying that he's not saying let's immediately negotiate, right? But I think there would be an improved chance of a deal, because I think that he's not invested in the notion of the settlements and Judea and Samaria in the way that, say, obviously Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but also Netanyahu and Likud, they are at this point deeply invested in the idea of the West Bank is Judea and Samaria, and therefore it's going to become part of Israel. And although what happens to the Palestinians under that assumption remains to be seen.
Well, yeah, and it's also funny to remember that one of the original parties that was elected with a portion of its platform dedicated to the idea of annexation and an establishment of what I would call an actual apartheid, as opposed to the often oft-labeled apartheid, was Bennett's original party.
Right.
It was talking about annexing West Bank territories and claiming that the Palestinians absorbed would have full rights except for voting, right? They would not be able to change the political reality into the country that they were absorbed into. They would get civil rights, which, for some of them might actually be an improvement potentially, but no political autonomy. So that idea certainly does exist on fringes of the right. I think Bennett has since moderated his views, but it is true that the annexationist part of the Israeli political system really seems to disregard what that reality would mean. Now, worth explaining for listeners that a lot of the territories that are in discussions for annexations in the West Bank are territories that, by almost any agreement, any form of a two-state agreement, would actually be part of Israel in land swaps. So it's not like most of the annexationists, even some of the more extreme annexationists, are talking about really just grabbing the entire land regardless of its demographic makeup. There are settlement blocks that have always been perceived to be part of any kind of land swap that would end up ending in an Israeli territory. And the annexationists would say, we're just getting ahead of it, in the same way that we got ahead of it by leaving Gaza and understanding that we are not going to keep Gaza under any sort of final map. Same with the territories in the West Bank. We're just going to get ahead of that because the negotiations are not going anywhere. So we're unilaterally going to leave the parts that we don't want and take the parts that are ultimately going to be ours. However, there are, of course, the tricky parts where you won't be able to draw a neat line between Palestinian territories and Israeli territories. And those are the populations that would have to be actually figured out in any kind of agreement. And the annexationists are just saying, take them and keep them as second-class citizens. So that is a problem that they have not really reckoned with, or I would say really put serious thought into, because it seems to me that most of the annexationists in Israel are just populists with no real vision. But that's my judgment. Okay, but we know that those annexationist positions in Israel represent a reality, but not really something that I think is going to tip over the election in anytime soon. And in fact, I would say that for many Israelis, even the ones who are not necessarily showing any appetite for negotiations with the Palestinians, annexation is more of a headache than it is a desired outcome. For most Israelis, I would say the current violence of settlers in the West Bank is somewhere between a true moral shame to, at minimum, a migraine, an unnecessary migraine to deal with these jackasses in the West Bank who've turned this place
because of the public
lawless.
Perception that they're
kicking
up, or
partly, but also because it's creating chaos. It's anarchy. And it's not, nobody's benefiting from this except for this small section of messianic fanatics who are feeding themselves with their violence. I don't think there's no political gain to that. There's not, in a Machiavellian sense. Of course, there's no moral gain in that, but there is also no political gain in that. It is just creating chaos, and it is just causing a loosening grip of an already problematic territory in the world. So I would say that most Israeli, I don't know if most, but a significant part of Israelis would be very happy to see these assholes being dealt with and the annexation talk being chucked aside, which is a question of changing of leadership, right? Which could happen with the right political configuration in Israel. Grant all that, I still don't know what our next step is to real change. Let's say Yair Golan might not get elected, but I feel like even something like a Lieberman and Bennett, who are far-right politicians, under their government, I would suspect there's going to be a lot more crackdown on violent settlers. There's going to be a lot more I think, I'm not sure, but I think there's going to be more emphasis on law and order, and potentially even an opening for long-term vision, which the Netanyahu government is just structurally incapable of. Let's imagine this beautiful reality of Ben Gvir and Smotrich are out of power. Netanyahu is no longer the the king of Israel, and we don't have a Yair Golan, but we have a more moderate, right-wing, hawkish government that is more pragmatic, more realistic, and is not so tolerant of chaos. What now needs to happen on the Palestinian street for us to actually see, an outreach, a real outreach?
There needs to be more kind of like grassroots advocacy for peace and advocacy for a long-term solution. That becomes incredibly important because right now, the peace camp on both sides has very little momentum because we've been stuck in conflict for so long. To many people on both sides, it feels like this is sort of unstoppable and unresolvable. If you talk to many people on the Palestinian side, even people who would say, yes, we absolutely want peace, they will still, oftentimes they'll still come back to, but it's not going to be solved anytime soon, because I think a lot of the time on the Palestinian side, the argument is that other than Gaza, which Israel did leave, the land in the West Bank has been ruled by Israel since 1967. With obviously the Oslo process changed things a bit. It created the Palestinian Authority itself, which is sort of in a sense it's like a devolved administration that aspires to become a full state, but is not quite a full state. And obviously people on the Israeli side, very many of them, they'll say, well, we don't think the Palestinians, they don't want peace. They want all of the land. There is this impression among very many people on both sides that the other side doesn't want peace. Even if one person says, oh, well, as an Israeli, I do want peace. I want a real solution. And you could have a Palestinian who says the same thing, but they don't trust the other side. So I think to answer your question, the long-term solution has to be grassroots piecework, and we have to kind of take this very carefully and step by step, but also in a background where, in many ways, the rhetoric is ramping up, and
right.
the aspirations of total victory in some ways are growing. I think on the Palestinian side there is a sense that by accusing Israel of committing genocide, that could be a long-term strategy of victory in terms of delegitimizing Israel and in terms of achieving international sanctions against Israel. So that's become one of the predominant strategies that we're seeing, both among people from a Hamas background, but also a Palestinian Authority Fatah background. Right? It's Israel is a genocidal apartheid ethno-state. Anyone who has any sort of dealings with Israel is therefore complicit in apartheid, complicit in genocide, and the long-term solution has to be more pressure on Israel. And that's definitely something that I've heard time and time again in the past 3 years from people on my own side is, no, we don't want peace negotiations with Israel. We don't want a real solution yet, because what we need to do is to increase maximum pressure on Israel, because Israel as a state wants us all gone. And I think that is as someone who kind of aspires to be, an advocate for a real solution and for peace, that's one of the biggest roadblocks. The pushback will be, you can't have peace with genocide. So that's a serious challenge.
I mean, you do understand unless we can have the discussion whether this is genocide or not. I'm just categorically going to dismiss the absurdity of the claim, because you can say war crimes, you can say an excess violence. I will totally reject the term genocide in this context. But I'm happy to argue with you about this if you think there is merit to the term. But I'm going to start from the position that this is an absurd claim, and if you wish me to defend it, happy to do so. But this is a problem if you're saying we're going to use genocide as a tactic to create pressure. You said they turn to the ICC in order to create pressure, but then we'll turn and say, well, we also don't want a solution because of genocide. So that to me already indicates bad faith engagement. There are people engaging in bad faith engagement. Yeah, that's true. But this is an important distinction. Like not to fall into the. Actually, I'm saying not to fall into the trap, but I am rushing into the trap of arguing about, not arguing or discussing the relative complicity. And I think there is an asymmetry. Now, let's grant the obvious fact that the current leadership on both sides is awful. It's just categorically awful. Like nobody in my life, let alone this podcast, but nobody in my surroundings of Zionist supporters of Israel, staunch supporters of Israel, has anything remotely supportive to say about the Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich alliance and the current state of government. From any perspective, like I can't even argue that it has been handling the war in an effective way. And I said, like, okay, at least they've waged effective warfare, which they just have not. So there's no redeeming factor to me on this government. So granted, the leadership is awful on both sides and is making things worse. However, on a structural level, we know that the grassroots movement and call for peace that you're hanging your hopes on has existed in Israel for at least 25, 30 years, and it has been, with oscillating success, dominating the discourse, right? And now, of course, post October 7th, it's been shattered, and I've had an argument on Twitter with Arash about whether or not Arash Aziz, whether or not this has been more than half of Israelis were like, whatever. We got into a very technical argument because of maybe a bad use of language that I had to describe just the total support of a two-state solution that existed in Israel and the legitimization of a Palestinian state. But we know that it's been a non-trivial segment of Israeli politics that's in fact defined the polars of Israeli politics for about 40 years, whether or not to make whether or not more concessions are incumbent on Israel in order to achieve this ultimate peace, right? That the Israeli left has decimated it as it is now for 40 years. And they have not disappeared. Like, they have not completely vanished. They're still haaretz. There are still organizations that are radically pro-human rights and radically in favor of combating the Israeli right-wing, hawkish, apartheidish regime, right? Those are Israeli organizations that exist and act, and in fact, so much of the critical information that we are able to have about abuses of power in Israel, and from settler violence to prison violence to war crimes, all of these things usually emerge from work that the grassroots left anti-war segment of Israel is conducting. So that segment exists in Israel. I would argue that they might not be doing a great job convincing the rest of our population that their way is the right way, but still, it certainly exists. Where is that on the Palestinian side, beyond you and a few other Palestinian expats who indeed embrace liberalism as their guiding light? Where is that? That strong?
I mean, there were big and genuine protests against the war and against Hamas in Gaza during the war. So
but you know that so many of these protests have been anti-Hamas, which is very legitimate because Hamas is an oppressive regime in and of itself, but not necessarily in favor of a two-state solution or in favor of putting down the violent resistance and seeking a peaceful solution.
Well, a lot of the polling of the Palestinian side, particularly in Gaza, does reveal support for a two-state solution. The Alrad polls from 2024 until now, a lot of them have shown that that's a plurality of Palestinians, and a majority of Palestinians in Gaza do support what they call two-state solutions side by side over the alternatives, which they give as, a Palestinian state from the river to the sea, or a one-state solution, equal rights. So the plurality of Palestinians in that polling, at least, and I know there are different pollsters and they have various levels of credibility, but some pollsters have found that there is decent support when you phrase the question in that way. I think there was a big problem of fraudulent polling of Palestinians after October the 7th, which showed that Hamas had been manipulating some of that polling for their own benefit. There was a series of documents that were found in Gaza apparently by Israel, by the IDF, talking about how Hamas had intentionally rigged some polls. The Times of Israel reported on that. So there were certainly a lot of polls after October the 7th that seemed to show support for Hamas. My sense is that at least some of that was fraudulent and was just an authoritarian regime kind of boosting their support, as authoritarian regimes are wont to do. Now, in terms of the genocide arguments, I do not believe that the Israeli government's overall intent was to destroy the Palestinian people. I would tend to be very, very skeptical of that. This being said, I can't like guarantee what the result of the ICJ case, Israel versus South Africa, or South Africa versus Israel, is going to be, right? I would say that my reading of international law, at least, is that in order for them to rule genocide, there can't be any alternative explanation to the acts, right?
Yeah, it is the harshest judgment. It cannot be...
Dolus specialis means specific intent, which means that there can be no alternative explanation. It can't be the Israeli government intended to destroy Hamas, and that then resulted in, severe suffering for the Palestinian people. That's not genocide. It would have to be that the Israeli government's intent was to destroy the Palestinian people. So I would personally be very, very skeptical of that as a finding. But, just in real personal life, if you're in a legal battle with someone, people will reach for almost any legal weapon that they can reach for. They decided that there was the possibility of going for the genocide decision.
First of all, even to use your metaphor, even when we're putting aside the total difference between sovereign states, legal system, and international law, because international law is nonsense, and categorically, because it is ultimately at the tolerance of different regimes.
It's a framework of agreements between states.
It's a framework of agreements, but it ultimately exists at the tolerance of entirely different legal regimes. So to have that genuine attempt to apply a legal system on international sovereign states, you actually have to have real shared values across these states that understand the legal framework under the same terms, and not just as another theater for international warfare. And that's just not the case. The areas where international law sort of kind of works is among states with shared values and principles. And I feel like the genocide case is categorically shows the failure of that system, that shows the weaponization of a system that is not really effective. NATO as a system has been much more effective in the sense that it was a system of treaties among states with shared value, with a very clear agenda of protecting the peace in the Western Hemisphere, let's say, or not even just the Western Hemisphere. It had a mission. It was organized around shared values, and the treaties withstood 70 years of the liberal world order. International law was never, I would say, really in practice or a real thing. But putting aside this rejection, even to use your metaphor, the prosecutors in cases, let's say in the United States, if a prosecutor wants to throw the book at a criminal, they do so either because they actually know that they can prove it, or because they understand that that there's a statement to be made that needs to be made in terms of the environment about like being extra harsh with this example case, making an example of this particular criminal or alleged criminal. And even if they lose the case, they're trying to make a statement. I think that it is clear, given the entire conversation about changing the definitions of genocide to accommodate the case, that this is an attempt to do the latter, not just to make an example of Israel, but also to directly target this state at any cost with the highest crime. And if we can't really prove it, if we don't really meet the preponderance of evidence to reach that degree of proof, we will lower the threshold as necessary. And that is just telling about the failure of the system. I mean, you can say that prosecutors conduct themselves this way even in a state legal system, but you'd call them corrupt.
But I think what it really shows is that there's an appetite for continuing this conflict and trying to jockey for position by whatever means possible. And that obviously that is in direct kind of conflict with what I want. I would like to see the conflict being resolved in kind of bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. But this being said, if there is a ruling against Israel in this ICJ case, I think it's going to extend all of this even longer, because it will then create this situation where there's a internationalized system of people trying to pressurize Israel as much as possible, whether that's through the UN Security Council, whether that's through Congress, whether that's through the legal systems of other third countries. So I think the battle is rather shifting arenas at this point, and I think that really the only long-term solution is what I mentioned, which is genuine face-to-face, point-to-point bilateral negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians to agree to a solution and to agree to a resolution of questions like refugees, questions like what are the borders, questions like what's the security arrangement going to be. That is still the only real substantive arena where we can actually make peace and end the occupation, live in a situation where there's real kind of like mutual development rather than mutual antagonism. That's still the destination that I'm incredibly determined to aim towards. But it seems to me like this is going to probably wrangle on for quite a while yet, with the Palestinian claim being that Israel is trying to commit ethnic cleansing and genocide, and with the Israeli claim, I suppose, also being that Hamas and the kind of there's been this introduction of this term Palestinianism. There's this Palestinianist goal of eradicating Israel. So
that's a term coined by Einat Wilf. Yes.
Yeah. Which, by the way, I've had some agreements with Einat Wilf over the years, but I don't like the term Palestinianism.
I assume it is intended to be aggressively provocative, of course.
Yeah, I believe the correct term for that view is actually anti-Zionism.
Right, I agree with you. I think she decided to invert that term as a tactic, like stop the fact that there is a legitimization of anti-Zionism as if that's a legitimate political case. I think she was like, okay, I'm going to fight in that arena. I will respond to this and start referring to it as Palestinianism. You've legitimized the idea. You've not you, John, of course, but you Westerners, leftists and other fools have legitimized the idea of eradicating Israel, turning it into the preferred outcome in the conflict. So I'm going to turn that around and say that maybe the problem was the self-determination of Palestinians was never about self-determination, but actually about eradication. Maybe anti-Zionism was actually the core component that guided Palestinian nationalism rather than actual nationalism. That is the argument. Putting aside the term,
and there is something to that. Large tranches of the pro-Palestinian movement is anti-Israel and anti-Zionist before it's pro-Palestinian. There is a great deal of tolerance for extreme Palestinian suffering, if that means the dismantlement of Israel, because of course their argument is that Israel is a cancer, Israel is fundamentally evil, Israel is comparable to Nazi Germany. They use this to legitimize extreme responses to it. So we are trapped in a cycle of delegitimization and dehumanization, and I radically don't like it. This is going to rock and roll on into the coming years and the coming decades, counterpunching on a legal level, on a reputational and legitimization level. Ultimately, it ends up tearing down both.
I mean, right? Yeah, when the incentives are to perpetuate the conflict, but you did acknowledge the fundamental point of Einat Wilf's argument, and which is putting aside again the term Palestinianism, which was chosen provocatively. But for much of the movement on the Palestinian side, the interest is revanchist and not really nationalistic. And that asymmetry slightly challenges your argument that we're looking at two sides who just want to destroy the other. Because Nat Wolff's argument is that one side wants to self-determine. The extreme ends of that side wants to self-determine at an expansionist level, right? Wants a bigger slice of the pie, which also means clearing that part of the others. But still, the goal is self-determination. Whereas in the other side, the goal is not self-determination necessarily, or at least in a prominent segment is not self-determination, but rather the extermination of the first side.
I mean, I do think that the Palestinian movement does want self-determination, right? But it's self-determination in an expansionistic sense of, and also a kind of theocratic sense, right? I think in terms of Hamas's ideology, it's very much about this land belongs to Islam, and I think they genuinely, deep in their hearts, they believe that this is Islamic land, and they believe that it is an offense against God to make an agreement that, such as I would advocate for, or even such that Yasser Arafat would advocate for, that they would, split the land and share the land. So, and similarly, you do see that on the Kahanist end of the spectrum. They believe this is a violation of an ancient covenant to say that this is the part of this is going to become Arab Muslim land, right? So,
right.
that, I think Palestinian nationalism is sincere, right? I don't believe the arguments that this is like some fraudulent pan-Arab nationalism. Maybe at one point those kind of pan-Arab currents were more dominant in the Palestinian national movement, but it has become a sincere form of Palestinian nationalism, and it is about self-determination. The problem is there are all of these groupings within it and kind of grudges, right? And the term I used in our last conversation is about irredentism, right? Commitment to this irredentist idea where all of this land belongs to the Palestinians, to the Arab nation, to the Islamic nation, whatever, with the Palestinian nation as the modern formulation of that. And we have to get our land back, right? And Zionism also has this irredentist notion to it of we have this land which was given to us by God. It was our covenant with God that created this, and we lost control of it. Whether some blame goes to the Romans and the destruction of the Second Temple, some blame goes to the Byzantines, some blame goes to the Arab conquests, some blame goes to the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire, right? But the goal of Zionism was to get our land back. And that is, I suppose, in a sense, the goal of the irredentist version of Palestinian nationalism is also that.
No, but I don't think that's a correct representation of the history of Zionism, because the majority of history of Zionism is first very secular, and the story is not about the covenant. The covenant is our historical identity, but the history of Zionism is very secular and pragmatic more than it was irredentist.
There's a mixture. It's a spectrum.
Yeah, but the religious Zionism was always a minority in Zionism historically before the State of Israel, and that's why pre-State of Israel, the majority of anti-Zionists were religious Jews, right? Those were the either hyper-assimilated Jews in Europe or religious Jews who rejected the Zionist project as premature, right? Mm-hmm. So the people who actually led the movement were mostly pragmatic, secular Jews from across the national spectrum of Europe who looked for a solution and saw Israel as their indigenous origin and that therefore a natural place to go to. However, for most of them, there was never an irredentist desire to expel or ethnically cleanse the territories. Of course, there were some such, but for the majority, we need to find a way to carve out a space among the local Arabs, the local Arab population, and whether it is buying some territories or some kind of agreed upon solution, there was never an idea of total uncompromising reclamation.
But if it were so, this is I'm asking you genuinely. If it were more secular, if it didn't have a strong religious element, then Israel could have been anywhere, right? It wouldn't have had to have been.
Because it can call nationalism a form of religion, which is fine, but it's not a God-created religion. The connection of Jewish peoplehood to the state of Israel has been cultural and historical and part of Jewish identity. Whether or not you believe in the literal covenant of a God that promises you this land, it has always been part of your identity to be diaspora people longing to return to the land. That is part of your identity. Nationalism is a story that you tell yourself about where you belong. And the story that Jews have told themselves for 2,000 years about where they belong was Jerusalem. That's why for 2,000 years, Jews in Europe said to next year in Jerusalem.
It's quite mind-boggling, really, to me, how long-lived that connection of the land has lasted. And that's why I do recognize Zionism as kind of a legitimate expression of the right to self-determination of the Jewish people. So I absolutely am not trying to advocate for anti-Zionism or trying to
for sure. To be clear, I don't want it to be seen as if I'm accusing you of that. I was just challenging the idea that irredentism was a key feature of Zionism.
I'm not saying it's necessarily a key feature. Like just on the level of ideas, we lost our land, we want to get it back, and that narrative in the Palestinian spectrum of we lost our land, we want to get it back. There is a common feature of that.
Fair enough.
I would say we both kind of have that in common. And in terms of negotiating peace, that is a legitimate grounds for trying to find some commonality and recognition of the legitimacy of both. We lost our land, we're trying to get it back. Now let's try and come up with a reasonable diagnosis of a sustainable solution that we can both live with, and where neither of us feels under pressure or in a situation where we're the loser. Let's try to build a situation where we both feel like we're winners.
Let me ask you then the question that originally made me invite you, because I keep challenging.
Wait, can I ask a quick question
of course.
about just going back to what you were saying about John about genocide and the use of the word. So when you're hearing folks throw around that term in your circle, what do you have a reaction to that? Do you have like do you kind of come at it from a is this terminology productive for peace kind of angle? Do you say like how are you defining it? I'm just curious how when people throw the term at you, how you respond to it.
I think a lot of the time now I've sort of avoided it, actually, because it's quite a difficult subject to approach, especially when other people have these incredibly strong and ingrained ideas that, yes, of course, Israel is trying to commit genocide. And I am sort of waiting. You know, I gave you my view. My view is that the Israeli government was not trying, their overall goal was not to destroy the Palestinian people. There's lots of things I disagree with the Israeli government about, right? There's issue after issue after issue, policy after policy after policy. But when I look at the evidence of what happened on October the 7th and thereafter, I don't believe that their overall goal was to destroy the Palestinian people in whole or in part. I believe that it was to destroy Hamas, and that resulted in severe suffering for the Palestinian people. Could there have been better facilitated evacuation to get civilians away from the conflict zone? Yes, I believe so. I think Israel tends to blame Egypt for not allowing the Palestinians to evacuate out into Sinai. I would say that that's not really a good enough response. But maybe let them go to the West Bank, right? Maybe there could have been some sort of facility in the Negev desert. Maybe Jordan could have been involved somehow. I don't know the exact prescription that would have solved the problem.
Let's also just not forget that all the efforts to relocate civilians from war zones was because Hamas was entrenched within civilian populations. So the fact that this was even necessary was because of Hamas's strategy, as should be obvious by now, but worth reminding. But second, that in every effort of Israel to relocate Palestinian populations to reduce casualties in war zones was then regarded by the same critics of genocide as ethnic cleansing, which is categorical proof of the bad faith use of these terms and their abuse.
It kind of cuts both ways. I agree with you that there is some bad faith attempts to say the war against Hamas is genocide and evacuating civilians is ethnic cleansing. On the other hand, I think there are big figures in Israeli politics who would love to see an ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
Ben-Gvir and Smotrich for sure, but
right.
but do they?
So
Ben-Gvir and Smotrich do not. But neither Ben-Gvir. We all know who Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are, and mind you, that whenever people make this criticism of Israeli government, you usually have the same three names that come up: Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and Orit Struk. Like those are the three characters that are vile, hyper-nationalist figures and have too much power. And as I've said many times in public and to you, I think it's an absolute shame that those people have as much power as they do in Israel. It is a shame,
it's
and
a problem for Israel, just as Hamas is a problem for Palestine.
Exactly. I think those people are not just vile. I think they are effectively unpatriotic and anti-Zionist in effect because of the damage that they do to the Zionist project. So no argument there. However, those people are not the people driving the war effort. Smotrich it runs the finance ministry, and Ben-Gvir runs the Homeland Security. And I would talk to you about the problem with him in a second. That's the reason I actually brought you on. But those don't really manage the war in Gaza. So it is disingenuous to suggest that, as opposed to the Hamas policy of using Palestinian blood in order to delegitimize Israel, which is the entire organization's commitment for martyrdom. It's not we do not need to cherry pick figures in Hamas and on the broader pro-Palestinian movement in the West to say, here are people who embrace the idea of washing the streets of Gaza with Palestinian blood if it leads to the delegitimization of Israel. That is the core strategy, the core warfare.
I think Ismail Haniyeh actually said it openly, is that we need the blood of the martyrs to awaken our revolutionary spirits. He said, including women and children, right? So
he emphasized children.
Ismail Haniyeh openly enunciated that as a strategy. And mimetic warfare and delegitimization of Israel. That's Hamas's MO. They want people to think Israel, think genocidal state, think apartheid state, think ethnic cleansing state, think must be dismantled. That's Hamas's media strategy. And in many ways...
And they pay for it with the blood of their own people.
But it's awful. It's despicable to do that. And it's anti-Palestinian to do that.
Oh, exactly.
And these are things that Palestinians are going to have to metabolize and work through over the coming years. And it's a difficult thing to put out there right now. This is why this is a conversation that I am almost a little bit hesitant to get into right now. Questions around genocide, around ethnic cleansing. I tend to think there's an ongoing case. Let's see what the result of the case is. I'm certainly not going to publicly accuse Israel of genocide right now, but it's an incredibly difficult conversation to have. And I think that is maybe the thing that makes me the most pessimistic about peace anytime soon. We've descended to this level.
I agree, and the result of the case, which I've expressed my view of the cases and the court's legitimacy, but the results of the case, should they end up libeling Israel and imputing genocide. And by the way, I would have been totally fine with any accusation of war crime, because I would not be surprised if war crimes were committed. And this
and just to be clear, there probably have been war crimes committed.
I would be shocked if there weren't.
That's my view as well. Serious war crimes committed against Palestinians, and I can never condone or excuse that. But there were serious and horrific and nightmarish war crimes committed against Israelis on October the 7th, and in the days and weeks after with the hostages in Gaza.
And I want to like, in focusing on criticism of Israel, I have never in my life shied away from accusing Israel of committing war crimes. I would say that many people in the Israeli military do try to hold on to some of the highest standards, and it is a fact that I know that international law lawyers are constant participants in strategic and tactical decisions that the military makes in order to try to limit and restrict potential war crimes. But that doesn't describe the entirety of the military, and that doesn't necessarily avoid the occasional dark choice, whether it was done through sheer cruelty and brutality or because of perceived necessity. Whatever it is, war is horrific, and people are made more brutish by participating in the war, and there's nothing that exonerates war crimes. However, that's my point, that the accusation of war crime is just not enough anymore. So it switches into imputations that have nothing to do with reality, and in so doing, as I said, delegitimize the entire project of international law. But to me, secondly, by doing so, it completely evaporates the incentive on the Israeli side to comport with perceived international law. The understanding that the standards of international law, as have been established for the past 70 years, have been abandoned by the institutions who are supposed to keep it. Just look at the UN report the other day saying that I don't think it's my job to verify accusations against Israel as they are presenting reports against Israel. If this is what international law is, what incentive does Israel have to even pretend to comport with it? So to me, the result of this trial are going to potentially horrific for everybody involved. I do want to ask you, though, about talking about criticism of Israel. Ben Gvir is the originally reason that I wanted to bring you on. And Ben Gvir is, I think, like I said, I think he is very anti-Zionist in his selfish and cruel behavior. I don't even need to recount all the awful things that he's been involved in. He has been, I am sure, allowing for more abuses of Palestinians to happen under his role as head of police, basically, in Israel. He has been taunting and humiliating the idiots from the latest flotilla, the latest Gaza flotilla, which again is... if this is the worst thing that happens to you when you're trying to penetrate a supposed genocidal state, then I think you're in luck. I don't think that that if a flotilla tried to penetrate through Nazi-occupied France, that the only thing that they would have received was some taunting from a Nazi minister. But okay, whatever. It is disgusting and hideous, and I do think that probably some of the violent abuses that have been reported on in prisons, at least some of them, I am sure, have some root in reality, and at least in part are the result of Ben Gvir's permission structure. So all of that is kind of awful, and I think that it is incumbent on every Israeli to condemn it. I was very encouraged to see many people, even in the Israeli government today, including Gideon Sa'ar, have condemned Ben Gvir's behavior because they recognize it as hideous. And unfortunately, Netanyahu, political coward that he is, political craven that he is, did not. But my question to you is, so far I've been pushing you about how do you keep people like me confident that there is a partner on the Palestinian side. I want to ask you the reverse of that. Somebody like me was really invested and interested in seeing the sane voices, the two-state solution voices, the part of the population that you claim exists on the Palestinian side that actually does believe in coexistence as the only ultimate way to survive this conflict. How do Israelis like me, who want to empower the liberal side, who want to get out of this constant cycle of bloodshed, how do we do a better job to reach the sane voices on the Palestinian side with the constant existence of people like Ben Gvir and the dark voices in the Israeli government? How do we overcome them to reach Palestinians?
Accountability is incredibly important, I would say. Look, there would have been no need for the war in Gaza had the Palestinians in Gaza arrested the perpetrators of October the 7th immediately, right? If those perpetrators were immediately arrested, the hostages released, and the people held legally accountable for their crimes against the civilians in Israel, then that would have been justice taking care of itself. So I think that the same thing applies on the Israeli side. There needs to be legal account. When there are crimes against Palestinians, there needs to be real oversight, real substantive with teeth process to hold people accountable. And I think also governmentally, I think that Ben Gvir and Smotrich, removing them from power democratically would be a huge step in the right direction. I think Netanyahu has empowered Ben Gvir and Smotrich. He knows what that entails, and he's chosen to do it. So I would say the same thing about Netanyahu. That's, as a Palestinian who wants peace, I think the end of the Netanyahu government, regime, whatever you want to call it, it would at least start making me feel a little bit more optimistic that maybe there's a chance. I don't know how good or bad Avigdor Lieberman and Naftali Bennett would be. I have my disagreements with them too, but fresh leadership is a positive sign. And we were talking about war crimes in Gaza. I think the best way to deal with these accusations about Israel systematically is to have legal accountability for people who have actually done wrong things on the Israeli side. That would be the best publicity for Israel, is saying, we have accountability for the people on our side who did something wrong. My dream of there being legal accountability on the Palestinian side for the terrorists of Hamas, that isn't going to happen anytime soon. But there is more hope that maybe there could be some sort of process on the Israeli side, because of course the alleged crimes at Cedar Taman, those allegations were essentially dismissed. I believe the prosecutor said that they couldn't get back in contact with the alleged victim who had been released into Gaza. To me, that's,
you're talking about the case of a report about abuse of prisoners at the Taman prison.
Yeah, that's right. Basically, there was an investigation, but essentially the investigation came to nothing.
Not only that, the investigator of the person who blew the whistle on the whole incident ended up being suffering political consequences for that.
Right, and that's completely wrong.
Right. The only person who suffered accountability for that was the person who blew the whistle on the potential abuse.
That's the mess that we're in right now. It's in a sense, it's kind of what's happened to me. And I don't mean to have a victim mentality here, but I criticized Hamas for what they'd done, and I blamed Hamas for a lot of the suffering for Palestinians. And so I to a lot of people on the pro-Palestinian side, I became the problem, right? So this idea of holding people in your own society accountable for criticizing, people who've done something wrong in their society, this is very dangerous. It means that people who might want to become a whistleblower in the future, whether if you see something wrong, if you see someone do something wrong on your own side, you should bring attention to it, right? I fundamentally believe in that. The hounding of this whistleblower in Israel means that future whistleblowers who might have seen something wrong and might be able to restore Israeli prestige in a sense by having some accountability for the wrongdoing, they're going to think twice about putting themselves in that situation, because they're going to be falsely branded as a traitor, just as I've been falsely branded by certain people as a traitor. And this is not right. It's a perverse incentive structure. And it results in people taking actions that are not going to be conducive ultimately to the good of the society that they're in, whether that's Israel or whether that's Palestinian.
Yep. I think it's one of the most heinous things that we've seen in Israel. To the legitimization of Ben Gvir and everything that followed was not only predictable, but predicted. So it's heartbreaking. And yes, I've got nothing to say, but hoping that a new government will be able to bring back some of the sense in Israel that we have agency and responsibility for our own society as much as we have to protect it from external foes, to cleanse it from internal rot. And that has been a strong force of, I think, Zionist identity from the beginning. Not always lived up to it, but I feel like that has tragically been thrown away to the wayside during this current government. And I hope it can be regained.
I think Netanyahu has left Israel in a much worse situation. Certainly, internationally. I mean, in terms of the domestic economy, Israel is actually kind of a miracle. It's kind of a miracle economy. Now, the Israeli GDP per capita has exceeded the UK where I live. So in some ways, I see
during wartime that is the insane thing. Israel under 3 years of constant warfare has become one of the most dominant economies in Europe.
Israel is an economic miracle, and it doesn't hurt me as a Palestinian to say that, because it's just true, and the truth shouldn't hurt me. And I genuinely hope for the best for our neighbors. Right? I see Israel as our neighbor. They are also our occupier, but fundamentally, eventually, they're going to be a neighbor. Hopefully, one we have a normal relationship with. So, of course, I want them to succeed economically, but. In terms of international relations, I think they've left Israel in the toilet. Yes, we can have certain criticisms of many of the criticisms that are leveled at Israel, and maybe some of the things that Israel is charged with are unfair and inaccurate and libelous. And I do think there is a problem of people making libels almost anti-Jewish libels against Israel for the sake of delegitimizing them. But at the same time, managing relations is about managing reputation, and Netanyahu
and managing reputation against the challenges that exist in the world. And even if we grant that there is a strong contingent of anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic views dominating the Western world right now, that is the reality that one must engage in as a statesman, and Netanyahu has completely abdicated that responsibility. But I think that critically, what we've just described about the abandonment of ethical standards and of responsibility has led to the erosion of Israeli civic society at, I think, the most precipitous rates that I've seen in a long time, maybe since the Second Intifada, and that is not entirely the Netanyahu government's fault, but it is, I would say, it largely is. That is a heartbreaking, and nor do I think that Israel would be able to preserve its economic growth if it shows such disregard for basic civic maintenance and cleaning its own house.
Right. Indeed, yeah, I agree.
So last question before you go. A funny thing that I've noticed you paying attention to on Twitter recently is the communism debate in Western societies. I guess you felt like you were not getting enough hate, so you decided to take on what I think some critics on the right say the green-red alliance between Islamist theocracy and communism. So how did you find yourself a defender of liberal capitalism, John?
Well, I think when I was younger, I was sort of really sympathetic to communism, right? I certainly read the Communist Manifesto. I read Das Kapital. I was probably more on this kind of Engelsian end of communism more than, maybe more the radical ones. Communism was kind of out of favor at the time when I got interested in it, but I got interested in it originally because I thought that we need to have provisions for everyone in society, right? Because I grew up personally in a quite a poor area. There was a lot of drug abuse. There were people who I went to school with, their dad had been to prison for drug offenses, criminal offenses, all sorts of things like that. I had that perspective. And I think the thing that stripped me of that was learning about debates that took place much earlier, which was the socialist economic calculation debate with Friedrich Hayek, where I became aware of that.
I was going to ask you if you've read Hayek, if that was part of your conversion.
I did read Hayek. And that kind of showed me that I might want a more equal society, but through central economic planning, that was pretty unlikely to happen. Of course, I do think that there's maybe a more interesting tangent to this is with enough computation power, does central economic planning become a little bit more feasible? That's a side debate. But I ended up more on the Hayekian end of the spectrum. And the more that I read and I learn about economics, the less charitable I feel about communism, because I feel like it's kind of a fallacy built on top of more fallacies, right? Because Karl Marx believed that labor was the thing that created value, and that value was objective. And by making a profit, capitalists were stealing from the laborers who created that value. And when I was younger, I probably read this and I thought, well, this is an interesting idea. I probably didn't interrogate it that deeply. But what I have done as an adult who has become interested in these issues is I have interrogated it more deeply. And I think that this is a steaming pile of horse manure, really, because it doesn't work like that at all in actuality. I think anyone who's ever run a business can tell you that that's not the case. Profit comes from many different areas, right? The price of sale of goods ultimately is whatever you can get away with relative to the market. And if you're at a music festival and you want to sell people bottles of water, you can charge a premium.
Which is to say that labor plays no factor in that.
Labor does not play a factor in determining ultimate profit. Labor is one ingredient out of many. And I think as we move into a world where labor can be automated much more easily through mechanisms like artificial intelligence, through mechanisms like robotization, it's going to become clearer and clearer and clearer that you can do a lot of stuff without any labor at all. I think we're moving to a world where a lot of businesses are just going to have one employee who's the person who owns the business, and then that one employee has 1,000 robots, 1,000 AI working for them. And it's going to become increasingly possible to do that as we go forwards in time. So the delusion of the labor theory of value will become clearer and clearer and clearer. But hopefully, the initial problem that attracted me towards communism, which is that some people don't have the basic necessities of life, will be addressed in a proper way, whether that is through government interventions like universal basic income, for example. We're yet to see if that is ultimately going to be the solution to this, I suppose the rise of AI. Labor. But it's one of the possibilities. Or more generally, whether that is through just society becoming much, much, much more richer, and there being enough kind of like charitable initiatives. Like if some guy has 10 billion robots, it's much easier for that person with 10 billion robots. And those robots can go out into the world and they can build things and they can solve problems for humans. It's much easier to eradicate poverty if you have that infrastructure in place. So I hope that in the long run, the thing that attracted me to communism, which was the fact that I grew up around many people who were in serious poverty, those problems will be solved. And that's, of course, that also applies in a place like Gaza. It's going to be much easier to rebuild something like Gaza if you have, mass autonomous infrastructure to do it. Hopefully, Gaza will be fully rebuilt before
we get to the point of having this degree of technology. Yes, I agree. Though it is interesting that the event, the singularity that as you say, categorically and dispositively puts the lie to the labor theory of value is the same event that is going to necessitate some amendment to free market. Probably if the most extreme views of what AI post-labor reality is going to look like, it is also going to need some redressing for how do you sustain society when labor no longer exists in a post-labor economy. I think
the question
might be that this is, of course, just a nonsense assumption that we in 20 years it will be, Y2K panic. But if it's not, then we would definitely need some kind of amendment to capitalism.
I think that question will be answered by the pragmatism of capitalists going forwards, right? Basically, what I'm suggesting is that in the post-AI world, people need to be able to build a business very easily with very little money up front. If you can do that and you can become a business owner, then is there really a need for UBI? Maybe not. We can just solve this by everyone having the ability to become entrepreneurs.
You're saying a world of 10 billion entrepreneurs?
Plausibly, yes. I mean, human wants are essentially infinite. human wants are essentially never satisfied. Whatever business idea someone has, there are ways to find customers, because people want stuff and they want services, they want goods.
Instead of having 3 studios, you can have 1 million people each producing their own full feature film and selling it for viewing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to predict what the goods and services would actually be. I would imagine that probably a lot of people will end up doing something artistic, though, because again, in an environment where the economic
basic
system,
scarcities are resolved.
Yeah, there was this meme that was very it felt a little bit profound, that it was scary that the first things that AI was learning to do was write poetry, create art, and humans were still, laboring away in coal mines, in care homes, in all these various low skill, not very fun employments. I do think that robots will transition into those areas, of course, right? In terms of things like personal care for people with disabilities or elderly people, harvesting food. Once you do get to that world, there will be opportunities for people to make art. It will be much easier for people in that sort of economy to say, well, what's my calling? And then you work on that until you find the audience that wants to accept what you're creating and buy what you're creating.
Yeah, and of course, this is the optimistic version of we've actually achieved the world of abundance, which
I'm suspecting we have.
I mean, that we have already.
I on the right trajectory towards it.
The right trajectory. Yeah. I hope so. I don't think it's impossible. But I don't know.
It's also like peace in the Middle East. It's not impossible.
Well, I think we are actually closer to abundance than we are to peace in the Middle East. Probably. I think, yeah, we have a clearer trajectory to resolving world hunger than we are to solving the Middle East requires completely changing mindsets of 2, or if not more, civilizations. So a little trickier to change minds than build factories at scale.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That's it. That's why I'm not particularly optimistic about the Middle East right now. I think we're on a difficult trajectory there in terms of resolution, and on the economic trajectory, it's looking substantially rosier.
It's a good note to end it on.
Okay, yeah. So John, we'll see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Give us 5 stars, reviews if you are so inclined, and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.